At what point can you call an album underrated? You could say that Nirvana's Bleach album is underrated, yet it has millions of listens, and the fact that enough people call it underrated, you have to actually ask, is it? But I'm here to talk about something I feel is genuinely underrated. It doesn't have the listens, the reviews, or even the defenders calling it underrated. An album that was written at one of the most pivotal points in the artist's life. The artist himself being from one of the biggest bands in the 90s, acclaimed as one of the best guitarists of his time, and yet no song on the album breaks past 50,000 streams. It also has barely any reviews about it, and the ones that it does have are anywhere from mixed to good. But I believe this album is worth so much more than that. I stumbled upon this album after being recommended the solo work of Graham Coxon. Graham is the guitarist for the band Blur, and during the band's several hiatuses, his output of music was the closest thing you would get to a new Blur album. The frontman for Blur, Damon Albarn, most famously had put out Gorillaz albums, but you'd be hard-pressed to find any Gorillaz song that sounded like a Blur song. Gorillaz was experimental, leaning more towards hip-hop roots, while Graham stuck with an indie rock sound. He was your go-to guy for that Blur sound. Anyway, I had seen Graham's solo work floating around and had even listened to a bit. Happiness in magazines, A&E, Love Travels at Illegal Speeds all came up in discussions. But then I was informed about one album I hadn't even heard the name of before. Crow Sit on Blood Tree. A weird name for an album, but I was highly encouraged to listen to it. Although I was warned it could be a bit of a difficult listen, whatever that meant. So I stuck it on, and I'm not gonna lie, I didn't really give it a fair listen. It's hard to give an honest opinion of an album when you're listening to it like this.
You know, you could probably just like get the clip and then like edit in like us screaming.
But I did catch one or two songs off the album that I really loved, saved them, and then I left it at that. And then about a year later, while I'm taking a walk with my dog, a tune pops into my head. It's simplistic, it's repetitive. Where had I heard this before? Crow Sit on a Blood Tree. When I went back to find the song, I decided I'd give the album another listen. There's really only one way to describe why I love the album, and that's by going through track by track, explaining why I find the songs so captivating and any backstory they have behind them, which we have first-hand accounts of from Graham's book, Verse Chorus Monster. The opening track, Empty Word, begins with Graham singing softly into the mic, then to be joined by an acoustic guitar. At first, it seems like the standard issue love song, but if you listen to the lyrics, it's kind of the opposite. Graham sings about how love is such an empty word and describes the person he's singing about as looking straight through him with red eyes. It makes for an interesting comment on repetitive love songs, but before he even gets a chance to expand on that, the song explodes into the next verse with drums, bass, and very noisy, distorted guitars. And this unexpected jump kind of reflects what the whole album will be like. It jumps from one emotion to another with very little, if any, warning. People say the album can be hard to listen to, which I'd have to agree with. It is a hard listen in the same way it's hard to listen to Radiohead's Kid A for the first time. It's something so unexpected you don't really take in what's just happened. But on your second, third listen, it starts to click with you. I'll move on to the second track now, I'm Going Away, a song that shows off the constantly changing tone in the album. We go from loud shouting of the first song to a slide guitar and a bass drum. That's it. You're going to learn very quickly that although the indie rock roots of Graham Coxon are still in this album, it is mostly a folk album, which is something, to my knowledge, he has never done prior to this album, either in Blur or in his solo work. The song just feels like you have given up. 2 lines repeat out for the length of the song. I'm going away, just for how long I can't say. The guitar sounds slightly out of tunes, and the strings on it sound like they're falling off the fretboard. That's the only way I can describe it. The only rhythm this track has is a bass drum, just slowly droning throughout the song. It's like trudging down the side of a road slowly. And this was the song that actually made me return to the album. It's not my favourite on the album, but I swear to God, give this one listen and the song will bury itself somewhere in your brain, only to return sometime later down the line. It sounds like a game over screen. Not overly sad, just fed up and done. All Has Gone is weird in the sense that the lyrics are about the world being horrible, and yet the instrumental, as relaxed as it is, there's a slight feeling of hopefulness to it, almost as if Graham is saying he's accepted that he's comfortable in that position. The song feels old, not as in, wow, so retro! No, it's like, no, it feels old in a really good way. It's not overproduced. It's stripped back to 1 or 2 guitars and a synth sound that reminds me of House of the Rising Sun by the Animals. Probably the second best song on the album. It's probably because around this time, Graham took a big interest into folk music, which he would hold for the foreseeable future. If you've ever watched the show The End of the Fucking World, Graham Coxon composed the music for that, and you'll definitely understand what I mean. Right, so we're 3 songs in and we've established an overwhelming theme of sadness. This is far different from anything Graham has put out before. Where is this coming from? Well, if we take a look at Graham's book, Verse Course Monster, we get why this is. Around the new millennium, things were stressful for Graham, to say the least. I was exhausted and I didn't care about anything very much, least of all myself. Throughout the Blur days, Graham had been drinking frequently, as you do when you're in a band. However, it got majorly out of control. Although he was attending AA meetings, he soon spiraled into a drinking binge. He became unsatisfied with Blur. Certain projects he would just refuse to show up for, or only show up if certain demands were met. He felt that a lot of aspects of the band became commercialized, which shows an empty word. Not to mention, to pile on top of this, Graham had recently had his firstborn child Pepper, which would cause stress to anyone, let alone somebody touring in a band who can barely see his family. He began having regular panic attacks, one of the worst he recounts.
There was a particularly bad one, at Old Street, when the train made a piercing, screaming sound and suddenly, in my imagination, seemed to be accelerating sharply downhill. The noise made by the friction on the rails reached a pitch that rose over me like a tidal wave, leaving me terrified and disoriented. I got off the train and had to curl up on the platform. No one offered me any assistance or comfort on the platform. This was London, after all.
We know why the album has such a strong feeling of hopelessness over it. On the brink of leaving a band he's been in for more than half a decade, a new child, alcohol abuse. When he got into the studio, it just culminated into the beautiful mess of a track listing. Burn It Down is exactly how you think a song with this title would sound. It's loud and there's no need to analyze the lyrics in this one. He says it with chest. He's done with everything. Everything is shit and he wants it all to burn down. One of the lines in the song even says, "I know you're gonna kill me, man. Just tell me when it's gonna be." If you listen to the song by itself or in a different album, it might seem like edge for edginess sake. But if you listen to it in context with the whole album and you know the backstory, it takes on a new, even darker meaning. It's a brilliant song. It's one of my favorites on the album. But going from All Has Gone to this is the equivalent of going 120 through your windshield. Too Uptight echoes a sentiment that Graham still holds to this day. He wishes that he could enjoy what he has, but he's unable to. He was in one of the biggest bands of his era while recording this, yet he felt like he was unable to enjoy any of it. Graham has said several times in interviews that he wished he enjoyed himself more during the latter days of Blur, and it seems that even during that time frame he was in Blur, he genuinely did want to enjoy himself, but he just couldn't bring himself to. Big Bird, for me, is a miss. No, I didn't mean you, I'm sorry! No! The instrumental starts off beautiful, but then adds this long drone over the second half of distorted guitar. The lyrics just describe a dead bird, and maybe I don't have the media literacy award, but I can't decipher any meaning other than the reoccurring feeling of sadness this album has. It's a fine song, it's just a worse empty word in my opinion. But finally, Tired gives us a gleam of happiness within the album, because it's done with a single guitar and Graham singing. The reason why it's got that feeling of happiness is because it was written about one of the few good things in his life at the time, his daughter. And the lack of instruments and the vocal treatment on Graham's voice makes it feel incredibly genuine. Like it wasn't meant to be on the album, as if somebody just walked past his room and recorded him singing it to his daughter. It's one of the few times on the album when he sings about something that makes him happy. It's just a lovely breath of fresh air that I'd completely forgot about until I revisited the album. Hurt Prone. I had this part in the script left blank for the longest time because I really just kind of have to let you hear it yourself.
I want you to be real blue.
Graham said in this book that he had fun making it. The song was basically sabotaged. I have to respect it in some ways. It's a stream of consciousness from somebody at an extremely vulnerable point in their life, but at the same time, it's barely a song. I do think it maybe could have fit on the album as like an intermission, kind of like how Intermission did on Modern Life is Rubbish, but it would have to be a lot shorter. It's the one consistent skip for me. Now, if you're going to take anything away from this album, listen to one song, Let It Be Bonfires. Remember how I said All Has Gone was my second favourite on the album? This one is not only my favourite on the album, it is 100% my favourite Graham Coxon song. It starts off quiet, like mixed actually really quiet. Graham practically whispers into the microphone. And once again, we get a song of hope. According to Graham, it was kind of like a lullaby for his new daughter. The creatures you dream of and the friends that you think of really care. And as the guitar hits its last note, the tone changes. The song becomes brighter and there's a swirling ambient in the background that just leaves you feeling peaceful. I could keep gushing about this song and trying to describe it, but words don't do it justice. Just please, if you do one thing, give this a listen. Thank God for the Rain is the most folksy song on a very folksy album. This one might actually push people away from it because it's just full on folk. There's no distortion or anything. It's just a guitar and Graham, but it focuses very much on the finger picking pattern, which might put a lot of people off. But it is a really good song. It describes the downfall of humanity, which I'm sure Graham was feeling at the time. It's a decent song, but there's not much to talk about. You Will Never Be. Okay, indie rock straight after the downfall of humanity. Okay. And A Place for Grief is the closer for the album, and it's a nice song to close the album out with. It sounds almost like an Elliott Smith song. And considering Graham and Elliott were friends at one point, it's not far of a stretch to say he was probably inspired by Elliott Smith. Again, there's not a lot to note, but that doesn't mean it's a bad song. I think it works as a closer to this mostly sad, slow album. And that's the album. You'll have seen I kind of skimmed past those last few songs. And it's just that those last few have a lot less to talk about than the first half of the album. They're not bad songs by any definition, just not much to talk about. It is not a perfect album, but I didn't claim it to be, and it doesn't have to be a perfect album for it to be underrated. I barely hear anybody even speak of this album, and from the listens on Spotify and the views on YouTube, you can see why. It's not because the album is forgettable, it's because it barely reached an audience, and the audience it did reach were understandably put off by the breakneck track listing and Graham's switch from indie rock to folk music. But if you push past those preconceptions, you have a great album with very few misses and plenty of amazing songs. Bonfires, All Is Gone, Too Uptight, Burn It Down. It has more folk influence than anything Graham or even Blur has done before it, but that's why I love Graham. He's always trying new things. So should you. Give the album a listen. It's hard to describe music without sounding like a pretentious cunt, so listening is the best way to see if you'll like it. I promise you'll find at least one song you like, and if you have any albums you think are similarly underrated that I might like, let me know. I'm always looking for niche new songs. And obviously, prior reading shouldn't be necessary for album's enjoyment, but hopefully the context I've given you from Graham's life elevates the songs like it did for me. It's an album he put his vulnerable self on the line to display for, similar to Weezer's Pinkerton, as stupid as that comparison is. And not many people got to hear it. And that's why I believe it is actually underrated.